In the dim corridors of Orbital Station Epsilon 7, emergency lights flickered on and off. The station's computer announced in multiple languages, "Critical system failure. All personnel must evacuate immediately." This is not a drill. Residents rushed through hallways, grabbing essential belongings before heading to evacuation shuttles. The wealthier occupants from the upper levels had already departed, leaving the middle and lower sections in controlled chaos. In residential pod 34B, a merchant named Min packed quickly, stuffing valuables into a travel case. He glanced at the small containment habitat in the corner of his quarters, where his Lulari pet watched with large amber eyes. "No time," Min muttered, sealing his case. The Lulari, a creature called Sori, pressed six-fingered limbs against the transparent wall of its enclosure. Min hesitated for just a moment before the next warning blared. He grabbed his case and hurried out, the door sliding shut behind him. Sori remained behind, abandoned. Hours passed. The station grew quiet except for automated warnings and the occasional groan of metal as the station's integrity weakened. The lights in Min's quarters dimmed as non-essential systems began to fail. Inside the habitat, Sori's iridescent scales shifted from vibrant blue-purple to a dull gray. The creature understood something was wrong. Its owner had never left for so long before. The feeding dispenser had stopped working, and the temperature was dropping. Sori examined the habitat's latch. The Lulari were known throughout the galaxy as simple, decorative pets, beautiful living ornaments that required little care beyond feeding and occasional attention. What most didn't realize was that their docile nature masked considerable intelligence. With careful manipulation of all six limbs, Sori managed to release the simple locking mechanism. The habitat door swung open, and the small creature climbed out onto Min's desk. The quarters were cold and dark now. Sori moved cautiously through the room, searching for food. In the kitchen area, it found an open container of nutrient pellets, not the specialized Lulari food it usually received, but edible enough to survive. A sudden violent shake rocked the station. Sori clung to the countertop as items crashed to the floor. The station's computer voice returned, now distorted. "Warning. Structural integrity compromised in sectors 12 through 17. Station decommission accelerated. Final demolition in 72 hours." Sori didn't understand the words, but the danger was clear. The creature needed to find safety and warmth. Moving into the corridor, Sori discovered a station devoid of life. Emergency lighting cast long shadows down empty hallways. Another tremor sent the creature scurrying for cover beneath a fallen ceiling panel. Over the next day, Sori explored further, discovering that the station's environmental systems were failing section by section. Cold areas became freezing. Others overheated dramatically. Food was scarce, just scattered remains in abandoned quarters. Most troubling was Sori's injured limb. During one particularly violent station shudder, the creature had been thrown against a wall, leaving one of its middle limbs damaged and painful. Movement became difficult, each step a careful balance. By the second day, Sori had created a small nest in a maintenance duct, where warm air still flowed intermittently. The creature collected bits of fabric and padding from abandoned rooms, creating a space just large enough for its small body. From its hiding place, Sori watched as sections of the station began to power down completely. Darkness spread like a living thing, consuming corridor after corridor. Strange noises echoed through the ventilation system. Metal contracting, air pressure changing, the death sounds of a massive structure preparing to collapse. On the third day, hunger drove Sori from safety once more. The creature limped through darkened hallways, searching for anything edible. In the station's common area, it discovered a service robot stuck in a repeating pattern, trying to clean a floor that would never be walked on again. Sori was resting, conserving energy in its makeshift nest, when a new sound reached its sensitive hearing. Not the creaking of the dying station, but something else, a mechanical hum, growing louder. Then, Unmistakably, voices, living beings had returned to the station. The Lulari's scales flickered briefly with renewed color. Was it Min returning? Had someone come back specifically for Xori? The creature crawled to the edge of the ventilation duct, peering out with hopeful amber eyes as heavy footsteps approached. These were not the familiar steps of its owner, but strangers, a salvage crew of humans who had no idea a living creature awaited discovery in the abandoned station. The human salvage ship Horizon Breaker docked with Epsilon 7 with a metallic clang. Inside, 5 crew members prepared for their mission: recover valuable materials before the station's scheduled demolition in 24 hours. "Remember, we're on a tight schedule," Captain Ta said, checking the oxygen levels in his suit. "Get what's on the list and nothing else." "The station's more unstable than they told us," Engineer Ju-1 said, studying her handheld scanner. "We should split up to finish faster." The captain nodded. 2 hours maximum. Stick to your assigned sectors." They entered the abandoned station through the main airlock. The emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow, making the empty corridors look like they were filled with blood. "Creepy," whispered Jin, the youngest crew member. "Feels like something from a horror story." "Just focus on the job," Tay replied. Ju-1, take Residential Section B. Look for computer cores and medical supplies." Ju-1 nodded and headed down the eastern corridor, while the others went in different directions. Her footsteps echoed as she walked. The station groaned around her, metal contracting and expanding as life support systems failed section by section. In Residential Section B, Ju-1 found what she was looking for. She knelt beside an exposed panel and began removing valuable processing chips. The work was delicate, requiring her full attention. That's why she almost missed the sound, a soft scratching coming from somewhere above her. She froze, listening carefully. There it was again. "Hello," she called out, immediately feeling foolish. The station had been evacuated days ago. No one could be here. The scratching stopped. Ju-1 shook her head and returned to her work. Just the station falling apart, she told herself. 10 minutes later, she had filled half her collection bag when something fell from the ceiling with a thud. She jumped back, her hand moving to the small laser cutter at her belt. On the floor lay a small creature. Its body was covered in scales that might once have been beautiful, but now looked dull and lifeless. 6 limbs ended in delicate fingers, and one of those limbs was clearly injured. Large amber eyes stared at Ju-1 with unmistakable intelligence and fear. "You're a Lulari," Ju-1 whispered, recognizing the species from her xenobiology classes. The creature tried to scramble away but collapsed from weakness. Ju-1 noticed how thin it was, how its breathing came in short, painful gasps. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly, kneeling down. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, she reached into her pack and pulled out a water container. She poured a small amount into the cap and placed it on the floor, then backed away. The Lulari watched her for a long moment before crawling forward to drink. It finished the water quickly, then looked up at her as if asking for more. "Someone left you behind," Ju-1 realized. During the evacuation, her communication device buzzed. "Status report," came Captain Tay's voice. Ju-1 hesitated, looking at the creature. "I'm in Residential Section B, found the processing chips we needed." "Good. Finish up and move to the next sector." "Captain, I found something else. A living creature. A Lulari pet that was abandoned here." There was silence. Then, "Leave it. We're not here for pets." The Lulari seemed to understand the words, or at least the tone. It backed away from Ju-1, amber eyes dimming. "It's injured and starving," Ju-1 argued. "It won't survive the demolition." "That's not our problem," Tay replied firmly. "We have a job to do." Ju-1 looked at the creature. It was watching her with such awareness, such presence. More than a simple pet. She made a decision. "I'm bringing it back with me." "Negative. We don't have resources. It weighs nothing, eats almost nothing." I'll take responsibility. Another silence followed, longer this time. The station shuddered around them, reminding Ju-won of the limited time they had. Fine, Ta finally responded, his voice tight with frustration. But if it causes any trouble, it stays behind. Clear. Clear, Ju-won said, relief flooding through her. She turned back to the Lulari, who had been listening to the entire exchange. You're coming with us, she told it, reaching slowly to pick it up. The creature tensed but didn't flee. I'm Ju-won. Do you have a name? The Lulari blinked, then raised one of its good limbs to touch her wrist. A soft trilling sound came from its throat. Sorry, Ju-won guessed, remembering that some Lulari responded to specific sounds. Is that your name? Sorry. The creature's scales flickered briefly with color, the first sign of health Ju-won had seen. Carefully, she wrapped the small being in a soft cloth from her pack and tucked it into her tool carrier. Another violent shudder ran through the station, strong enough to knock tools from nearby shelves. Time to go, she whispered to her new companion. This place won't last much longer. As she hurried back toward the rendezvous point, Ju-won didn't realize that this simple act of kindness would change not just her life, but potentially the relationship between humans and the wider galactic community forever. Ju-won hurried through the station's corridors, the small carrier containing Sori clutched tightly against her chest. She could feel the creature's rapid heartbeat even through the fabric. Almost there, she whispered as another tremor shook the station. When she reached the meeting point, the other crew members were already waiting. Captain Tae's expression darkened when he spotted the bundle in her arms. That's the creature, he asked, his voice tight. Ju-won nodded and carefully opened the carrier to reveal Sori. The Lulari blinked in the brighter light, its scales shifting slightly from gray to a very pale blue. Security Specialist Hyun stepped forward, frowning. Those things are expensive pets. Someone will claim it. Someone abandoned it to die, Ju-won countered. Look at its injured limb. Medical Officer Sue approached carefully, her professional curiosity overriding her hesitation. May I? She asked, holding out her hands. Ju-won gently transferred Sori to Sue's waiting arms. The creature remained still, watching everything with those intelligent amber eyes. Dehydrated, malnourished, Sue observed, gently examining the injured limb. This needs proper treatment, but not life-threatening. We've got 10 minutes before our window closes, Dae reminded them from the doorway. As the ship's pilot, he was visibly anxious about their timetable. Captain Tai checked his device and nodded. Move out. We can discuss this further on the ship. As they started toward the airlock, the station lurched violently. Warning lights flashed red, and an automated voice echoed through the corridors. Critical structural failure imminent. Evacuate immediately. Run, Tai ordered as ceiling panels began to fall around them. They sprinted down the corridor, dodging debris. Ju-won had taken Sori back from Sue and clutched the carrier close. The creature clung to the inside with 5 limbs, the injured one held protectively against its body. Just as they reached the final corridor before the airlock, a terrible groaning sound filled the air. Hyun, who was leading the group, looked up just as a large section of the ceiling collapsed. Hyun, Dae shouted as the security specialist disappeared under the debris. Captain Tae rushed forward, trying to lift a heavy metal beam. Help me, he called. He's trapped under here. The crew scrambled to assist, but the beam was too heavy. Sue knelt beside the debris pile, trying to reach through a gap to check on Hyun. He's conscious but pinned down, she reported. We need to move this beam. The station's breaking apart, Dae said, his voice rising with panic. We have minutes, maybe less. Ju-won set down her carrier and joined the others in trying to move the beam. Suddenly, she felt movement at her feet. Sori had climbed out of the carrier and was examining the debris pile with focused attention. Sori, stay back, Ju-won warned. It's dangerous. But the Lulari ignored her, scampering over smaller pieces of debris until it reached a narrow gap. Without hesitation, the small creature squeezed through the opening and disappeared into the pile. "What is it doing?" Captain Tai asked, momentarily distracted from their rescue efforts. Inside the debris pile, Hyun lay trapped and in pain. His leg was pinned and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. He was startled when something touched his arm. The Lulari was beside him, examining the beam that trapped his leg. "Get away," Hyun muttered, trying to wave the creature off. But Sori moved with purpose, squeezing deeper into the wreckage. The Lulari found the place where the beam was wedged against a smaller support structure. Using all 5 of its functioning limbs, Sori began to push against a small piece of metal, a connector that was holding the larger pieces in place. Outside, the crew watched in astonishment as pieces of debris shifted slightly. "It's trying to help," Ju-won realized. Encouraged, they renewed their efforts to lift the beam. As they strained, Sori managed to dislodge the connector piece. The debris shifted just enough for the crew to lift the beam a crucial few centimeters. "I can move," Hyun called out. With Su's help, he dragged himself free just as the beam crashed back down. Sori emerged from the debris, scales now covered in dust, but flashing with more color than before. The creature limped back to Ju-won, who scooped it up gently. "Did you see that?" Dai asked in amazement. It knew exactly what to do. "We can discuss the creature's engineering skills later," Captain Ta said, helping Hyun to his feet. "Let's move before we're all crushed." They hurried the final distance to the airlock, the station breaking apart around them. Just as they reached their ship, another violent shudder ran through the station. They tumbled into the horizon breaker, and Day rushed to the controls. "Disengaging docking clamps," he announced, fingers flying over the console. "Hang on." The ship pulled away from the dying station just as a massive explosion tore through its central core. Through the viewport, they watched as Epsilon 7 began to break apart in earnest. In the medical bay, Su carefully examined Sori while the others watched. The Lulari sat perfectly still, allowing her to splint its injured limb. "You saved Hyun's life," Ju-won told the creature, gently stroking its head. Hyun, his own injuries being treated, looked at the small alien with newfound respect. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "Thank you." Sori's scales flickered with bright blue and purple, a sign of contentment that none of them yet understood but would soon learn to recognize. The creature had found new companions, ones who saw it as more than just a decorative pet. Back on Earth, Ju-won's small apartment became Sori's temporary home. She had converted her spare room into a comfortable space for the Lulari, with soft blankets, climbing structures, and plenty of natural light. "The authorities still don't know what to do with you," Ju-won told Sori as she changed the bandage on its healing limb. "Technically, you're considered property that should be returned to your owner or another Centauri citizen." Sori watched her with those intelligent amber eyes, head tilted as if understanding every word. In the 2 weeks since the rescue, the creature had recovered remarkably. Its scales now shimmered with healthy blue-purple hues, and it moved around the apartment with growing confidence. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Ju-won's neighbor and a xenobiology researcher at the Earth Science Academy. He visited daily, fascinated by their unusual guest. "How's our friend today?" one asked, setting down a case of equipment. "See for yourself," Ju-won replied. One sat cross-legged on the floor, and Sori immediately approached, examining the case with obvious curiosity. When one opened it to reveal a series of puzzle objects, the Lulari's scales brightened with interest. "I've been researching Lulari in our databases," one explained, handing Sori a puzzle cube. "Something doesn't add up." Ju-won watched as Sori turned the cube in its 6-fingered hands, quickly figuring out how the sliding pieces worked. "What do you mean?" "They're classified as semi-sentient decorative companions. Basic problem solving," minimal communication abilities, and simple emotional responses. One gestured toward Sori, who had already solved the first puzzle and was reaching for a more complex one. But that's not what I'm seeing. Sori completed the second puzzle in minutes. One pulled out a tablet and played a recording of Lulari trills and chirps. Sori immediately looked up, responding with similar sounds, but in a different pattern. "It's correcting the recording," one said, excitement in his voice. Ju-1, I think the official data on Lulari is deliberately misleading. Over the next few days, one brought increasingly complex tests. Sori demonstrated not just intelligence, but a remarkable aptitude for pattern recognition and problem-solving. Most surprisingly, the creature began to communicate by arranging magnetic letters on Ju-1's refrigerator. One morning, Ju-1 woke to find a simple message. "Thank you. This is unprecedented," one said when she showed him. "I've requested access to restricted xenobiology files through my department, if my suspicions are correct." The confirmation came 3 days later. One arrived at the apartment looking pale and angry. "I was right," he said, handing Ju-1 his tablet. "The Centauri Alliance has been hiding the truth for centuries. The classified reports revealed a disturbing history. The Lulari had once been a developing intelligent species with their own language and culture. 300 years ago, the Centauri encountered them and recognized their potential as perfect companion animals, if only they were less intelligent and more docile. They genetically modified them," Ju-1 whispered, horrified. "They suppressed their cognitive abilities and language centers, and bred them specifically for aesthetic appeal," one added. "The Lulari we know today are purposely kept in an intellectually stunted state." Sori had climbed onto the couch beside them, looking at the images on the tablet. The creature touched the screen where a picture showed Lulari in their natural state, slightly larger, with more pronounced cranial features. "But Sori seems so intelligent," Ju-1 said. "Some traits are hard to breed out completely," one explained. "And it appears that when given proper stimulation and treatment, some Lulari can overcome their genetic limitations to some extent." That evening, Captain Tai and the rest of the Horizon Breaker crew gathered in Ju-1's apartment. They watched in amazement as Sori arranged letters to communicate with them. "Home far," the creature spelled out. "Your original home?" Sue asked gently. Sori rearranged the letters. "All Lulari home. It's asking about its species," Hyun realized. He had been the most skeptical of the crew, but now he watched the alien with newfound respect. The implications were enormous. An entire sentient species had been enslaved, their very nature altered to serve as pets. And humans, newcomers to the galactic community, were the first to recognize the truth. "We need to take this public," Day suggested. "People need to know. The Centauri Alliance won't let this happen quietly," Captain Ta warned. "They've built an entire industry around Lulari trade." Ju-1 watched as Sori arranged new letters on the refrigerator. "He'll po theirs." "We will," she promised, gently stroking the creature's head. "Whatever it takes." That night, as Ju-1 prepared for bed, she found Sori sitting by the window, looking up at the stars. She wondered if the creature was thinking of others like itself, trapped in their genetically modified bodies, treated as living decorations rather than the intelligent beings they truly were. "We'll make this right," she whispered. "Somehow." Sori turned to her, amber eyes reflecting the starlight, and Ju-1 knew their discovery would change everything. 6 months had passed since Sori's rescue. The small alien now stood on the observation deck of the newly built space station Sanctuary 1, watching as transport ships arrived carrying more of its kind. Each vessel brought Lulari, who had been purchased from their owners by the Earth Coalition's Liberation Program. 23 new arrivals today, Ju-1 said, joining Sori at the large viewport. "That makes over 400 so far." Sori's scales shimmered with bright colors as it spelled out words on the communication pad it now carried everywhere. More coming soon. The revelation about the Lulari's true nature had shocked humanity. The evidence one had uncovered sparked outrage across Earth's colonies. Unlike the older galactic civilizations who had accepted the practice for centuries, humans saw the genetic modification of a sentient species as slavery in its most insidious form. Captain Tai entered the observation deck, looking tired but satisfied. As the commander of Sanctuary 1, he had worked tirelessly to create a safe haven for the Lulari. The Centauri delegation has finally agreed to a meeting, he announced. They want to discuss what they're calling the Lulari situation. You mean they want to protect their profitable pet trade? Ju 1 replied with clear disgust. Ta nodded. 3 other major species have joined their side. They claim we're interfering in cultural matters we don't understand. Zori's pad lit up with new words. We seek for ourselves now. Indeed, that had been the most powerful development of all. With the genetic suppression treatments ended, and with proper education and care, the Lulari were rapidly regaining abilities their ancestors had possessed. They learned human languages quickly, and those like Zori who had spent more time free were now teaching others. In the large community space below, dozens of Lulari gathered in learning circles. Some were newly arrived, still timid and confused by their sudden change in status. Others, who had been at Sanctuary 1 longer, guided them with patience and understanding. The medical team has made progress with reversing some of the genetic modifications, one said, joining them with a tablet full of reports. No longer just a neighbor, he now led the scientific team working with the Lulari. It's slow, but each generation should show improvements. Hyun arrived next, his security uniform crisp despite the long hours he had been working. Since being saved by Zori on the abandoned station, he had become one of the strongest advocates for Lulari rights. We have a situation on the lower deck, he reported. A Centauri merchant somehow got past security. He's demanding the return of 3 Lulari he claims are his property. Tae's expression hardened. Escort him to my office. I'll deal with this personally. Before he could leave, Zori touched his arm. The communication pad displayed a simple message. I will come. Are you sure? Ju 1 asked, concerned. These confrontations can be difficult. Zori's response was immediate. They mused CEUS as EQUALs. In Ta's office, the Centauri merchant paced angrily. His elaborate clothing marked him as wealthy, his blue-tinged skin flushed darker with rage. This is outrageous, he sputtered when they entered. Those 3 specimens cost me a fortune. They are legally my property under galactic common law. His words faltered when Zori entered the room. The small alien walked with dignified purpose, its communication pad held confidently in its front limbs. What is this? The merchant demanded. Why is this pet not in a proper containment? Zori's pad lit up. I am not APET. I am LULR. The merchant stepped back, clearly disturbed by this direct communication. This is some human trick, he insisted. These creatures cannot speak, because you deliberately bred that ability out of them, Tae replied calmly. But it seems your efforts weren't as successful as you thought. Zori approached the desk where a document awaited signing. The Declaration of Sentient Rights for the Lulari species had been drafted by human and Lulari representatives working together. If adopted by the Galactic Council, it would forever change the status of this species. The merchant watched in disbelief as Zori carefully pressed its 6-fingered hand onto the document scanner, adding its biometric signature alongside those of human representatives. You cannot do this, the merchant said, his voice now uncertain. The economic disruption alone has already begun, Tai interrupted. Earth will not participate in the enslavement of a sentient species, regardless of how acceptable other civilizations find it. On the communication pad, Zori typed out a longer message than usual. Your 3 LULARI are here by choice. They learn and grow. They remember who they were meant to be. You cannot away. He was never yours. Later that day, Ju-1 found Sori in the education center, teaching a group of newly arrived Lulari how to use communication tools. The sight still filled her with wonder. This small being she had found abandoned on a dying station was now helping to liberate its entire species. The merchant left empty-handed, she told Sori. And the Earth Coalition has just announced sanctions against any world that continues the Lulari pet trade. Zori's scales rippled with colors that humans were learning to recognize as happiness. On its pad appeared a simple message that summed up everything they had accomplished together. We were forgotten by many, remembered by humans. Now we remember ourselves. The end.